No matter what you think about the OP13 meta, one thing's for sure, it's quite possibly the cheapest meta we've seen in a while. Other than a few outliers like the 10-cost Roger and the 4-cost Mr. 2 Bond Clay, through a combination of the PRBO2 reprints, the Learn Together deck reprints, and the power creep of OP13, making newer cards much more viable than older cards, the vast majority of cards in this meta are extremely budget friendly. Normally you have to dig quite heavily into off-meta picks for these types of videos, but this one might look quite similar to the tier list I made recently. In this video, I'm going to be highlighting 5 of the best budget decks in this format, discussing their prices and alternatives to the expensive cards where applicable. Prices will be based off the card market, 7-day trending, and I'm going to assume you can get most commons, uncommons, and cheap rares off your locals for a pretty low cost. I'll also have lists for each, and links to gameplay videos where you can see how the deck works to get an idea of if it will be the right deck for you. Do note, the lists in some of those videos may be slightly different from the ones that I showcased today, but they will still give a good idea of how the deck plays. First up is Emu. Depending on who you ask, Emu is either number 1 or number 2 in the OP13 meta. Extremely powerful, yet with a lot of complexities and a lot of room for improvement as a player. Emu is a good pick if you're someone who's trying to improve at the One Piece trading card game. Emu offers you a little bit of everything. You've got counter events, blockers, removal, rush, power manipulation, and so on and so forth. If you enjoy late game focused decks with a high skill ceiling, I would probably recommend Emu as the deck for you. And if you do want to try out Emu, I would recommend a deck list a little bit like this one, with the vast majority of cards being brand new OP13 cards, as Emu is locked really to the Celestial Dragons archetype. The only mandatory inclusion with any value is the 10-cost 5 Elders. This is absolutely non-negotiable. This is the card that the deck is working towards, and it almost feels like an extension of your leader to some regard. This is one of the most crazy endgame cards we've ever seen, bringing out ridiculous value for just 4 Don. And the fact that this goes positive in card advantage is one of the big reasons why Emu's late game is the absolute best in the game. All the rest of the cards, all the Elders are all rares, so you should be able to get those pretty handily off your locals. A lot of the other cards in this deck are commons and uncommons, or very cheap rares from older sets, like Shirahoshi, that have been reprinted since then. The main other tech card you may see that has some value is Stussy. Stussy is a tech card that is primarily for Ace matchup, but can also come in handy into Roger and 9-cost Zoro decks, like Red-Green Luffy or Lim. She's currently running for around £4, however you do typically only need 2. I'd recommend grabbing 2 Stussies as well, in addition to these Elders, just so that you have the option. Even if you decide that you don't like Stussy, the meta may change and you may decide that you need Stussy for this tournament, so it's a good card to have. In total, you should be able to pick up the whole of this deck for around £30, which for a top meta deck is an absolute bargain. I've seen precons in some games go for more than this, so being able to get the whole deck for £30 is crazy. And if you do want to check out some Emu gameplay, there's a card on your screen about now. Green Zoro is the final remaining top 3 deck that is not a leader from OP13, though he does make good use of a few new cards, primarily the 4-cost Zoro and the 6-cost Law. Zoro has a very aggressive and unique playstyle, being able to control your opponent's board whilst also pressuring life due to his very strong leader effect. And he also has the ability to close out games extremely quickly against really any deck, but especially if your opponent is unprepared for this matchup. If you want to play Zoro, this is the list that I'm playing at the moment. It's a very standard list. All 4 ofs, we're trying to keep things as simple as possible with Zoro, so that we increase our consistency on doing our optimal game plan. In terms of the card prices, there are only 3 standouts, and in my opinion, these are all non-negotiable. Firstly, the 1-cost Perona not only is your best searcher, but also your best bounce target for that new 6-cost Law. Being able to search and then pick her back up to play out a 5-cost for 6 Don, it's crazy. And then that lets you reuse your Perona later on to get even more digs towards seeing more copies of mainly Tashigi. Perona is currently going for around £5 at the moment. So about £20 a playset. And I do think this deck doesn't function without Perona. I would just grab yourself a playset if you want to play Zoro. Next up, the ST12 Mihawk is a 2K that's gone from seeing no play at all to being by far the best 2K in the deck and is heavily involved in your high roll. This is due to his synergy with the new 4-cost Zoro. The Mihawk has the ability to play out said Zoro, and because the Zoro restands himself at the end of the turn, that offsets Mihawk's downside of playing characters rested. Normally when you would play a character off the Mihawk, they're then vulnerable to your opponent, so they might get taken out before you can do anything with them. However, because the Zoro restands at the end of the turn, that offsets Mihawk's downside, right? So effectively you get a 1-4 and a 0-5, and then you have 2 more Don to either swing big, play Searchers, play Koshiros, as soon as your 3 Don turn. This high roll puts great pressure on even the most prepared of opponents, and is very important, especially into Emu, but also into other decks like Roger or Yellow Bonney. Mihawk's currently running around £7 a copy, and I would strongly recommend getting this, especially if you know your locals has a lot of Emu. If you knew for some reason your locals doesn't have many Emu players, you could maybe skip this card. However, it's still very, very powerful into pretty much everything except Ace. Do note there are 2 prints of this Mihawk. There's the regular print from the ST12 itself, and there's also an alt art print that came in an illustration box. Both are around the same price, so make sure you check both. Depending on which country you're from, one may well be cheaper than the other. The final card to talk about is Cavendish. Now this guy was never budget friendly. This guy used to be ridiculous. I think he was like £30–40. It was crazy. However, due to both the reprints in the Learn Together starter decks and the RBO2, this guy's down to just £3 a copy. Big up Bandai for that one. They absolutely hit on Cavendish when we most needed him. Cavendish is your alternate 5-Don play. Obviously, we're playing Zoro. We would love to play Tashigi pretty much every time. But in situations where you either don't have Tashigi or Tashigi isn't useful, if your opponent didn't play a character, for example, then Cavendish is very good as an alternate option. You could replace this with 5-cost Smoker, but I would personally just recommend buying the Cavendishes. They're only going for around £3 a copy. You're not going to save that much by buying Smokers, and the fact that Cavendish has counter, as well as gives you more Dons total, is a solid upside over the Smoker. In total, these playsets will cost you around £60, which is on the upper end of what I would consider budget. However, the rest of the deck is very, very cheap. You're not going to pay more than a few pennies for most of these cards, and a lot of them you should be able to get free off your friends at locals. So I do still think this fits in with a budget theme. If you're someone who likes more aggressive decks, or you're a newer player, because Zoro is fairly simple compared to Emu at least, Zoro is a great pick, and if you'd like to see some gameplay, there's a card on your screen now. Roger is one of the coolest new leaders out of OP13. He's big, he plays big guys, and he gets even bigger. If you're someone who likes straightforward game plans with serious power, Roger may well be the deck for you. This is the first deck we're going to have to make some concessions with, however. Most Roger lists do play 4 of the Mr. 2 Bon Clay, and also 4 copies of the 2K Uta. Mr. 2 is way outside the realm of a budget list. I can't recommend that one to you. And the Uta is going for around £5 per copy. If you do have a spare 20 quid on top of the other cards we're going to talk about, I would recommend picking up the Utas. She's very useful for Roger, because you always have big guys on board, so she just becomes a very, very cheap blocker. That's also a 2K. However, if you don't have that £20, she is replaceable. Here's a more budget-friendly list of Roger on your screen now. And elephant in the room, yes, we do still play 10-cost Roger. This guy has had a huge go up this set, and he's now going for around £15 a copy. I do think he's mandatory, however, if you want to beat the big two, right? Emu and Ace, they both love their blockers. Roger is very, very often always, a part of your win condition. Fortunately for us, you only need 2 copies, and he is searchable off your 1-cost Shanks. And the rest of this list is quite budget friendly, even though that Roger is around £15 a copy. OP01 Sanji is another useful 2K. This is particularly useful into Ace. You put him on the board, and then if your opponent leaves you at 1, you can play 10-cost Roger, activate Sanji's effect, go down to 0, to turn on your Roger's effect. Ace has some amount of difficulty dealing with this Sanji. He either has to expend a lot of Don on something like a Jozu to balance a 2-cost 2k, or just kind of live with it being there. There's not many opportunities that he has to get rid of this Sanji guy. So I do personally think it is worth picking up at around 250 a copy for £10 for your playset. And the final card that I want to talk about is the 8-cost Rayleigh. This is fresh out of OP13, so the price is pretty low at the minute. OP13 prices in general are really quite good. He's going for just over £1 a copy, so about a £5 for your playset. And Rayleigh is your best play on 9 and often a really good play on your first end on turn, as well as being a decent alternate closer. Being able to rest down blockers and just ignore them, things like Walkyrie and Marco, is great. And also being able to rest down your opponent's characters in the earlier portions of the game to try and pressure those, to keep them from attacking into you while you're at your weakest, is also very effective. All in, these cards, minus the Utas and the Bon Clays, will go around £50, so you definitely could consider Roger a budget-friendly deck, and a very powerful one in the OP13 meta at that. If you'd like to see some Roger gameplay, check out the card on your screen, though I will note this video is a little older than some of the others that I've linked. Lim is the absolute queen of Value Town. She's always been a mega budget deck, but now in OP13 I believe she is a great deck, period. If you like decks that go wide, go fast, and ramp ahead of your opponents, Lim is the deck for you. Here's the list of Lim I played in my recent Lim video, and there's only really 2 cards we need to discuss. First, the OP13 Shanks, currently going around £1 a copy. This card is one of your big payoffs for ramping, giving you all of your Don back to further your aggression, or for you to hold up for counter events. There's also a weird interaction where you can use Lim's leader effect after playing 10-cost Shanks, because 10-cost Shanks only blocks you from playing cards from your hand by paying their costs in the normal way. You can still use effects after playing 10-cost Shanks, such as Lim's effect, or if you had a character that let you play characters. This gives you a lot of versatility, and this OP13 Shanks is very, very staple in Lim lists. However, he's only around £1 a copy. What a treat. The other big payoff you have is the 9-cost Zoro. The 9-cost Zoro is a bit more contentious. Not everyone runs this, but I personally do like it, especially for the Emu matchup. Into Ace, this is less effective because it can be red-rocked very, very easily. However, into Emu, they're going to have trouble dealing with this. If they're even on 9 Don, they've got to have their Stussy. Sometimes you can drop this just before they get to their 9 Don turn, at which point they can't answer it, and then it swings 3 times. What a treat. Zoro is currently around £16 for your playset, bringing the total of these cards up to around 20 quid, which, similar to Emu, is the cheapest deck on this list. And if you did decide you didn't want to run the Zoro, you didn't want to invest in those, I mean, you can build the whole deck for like £5 or £10. It's crazy cheap with Lim. And she is good in this format, make no mistake. All of the rest of the cards in the deck are uncommons or rares, or a couple of really cheap SRs. And these cards are so cheap because they're not really useful in other decks. Odyssey cards that Lim makes use of, they're just not good enough when you're not playing them for 3 Don and ramping. So nobody else really plays these cards, and as a result, you should be able to get pretty much everything outside of the Shanks and the Zoro from your locals pretty cheaply, if not for free. If you do want to check out some Lim gameplay, there is a Lim video on your screen now. Finally, one more OP13 leader that I think is a lot of fun is Jewelry Bonney, the yellow edition. If you like gambling, life burn effects, and annoying your opponents with triggers, Bonney may well be the deck for you. Here's the list of Bonney that I was playing in my most recent Bonney video. Card on your screen for that video now. And whilst I would say Bonney is a little bit weaker than these other decks, she can absolutely compete in this meta, and is also very budget friendly. The most expensive card in this deck is the Boa Hancock from PWO2. This has had a bit of a price rise recently, in hype for OP14. However, she is good in Bonney in OP13. The main reason you play this is to stop green Zoro from attacking. Of course, it's useful into pretty much any matchup. However, into green Zoro especially, he's a deck that really heavily relies on his leader, right? So turning off the leader from attacking Effectively gets you out of a whole turn, which is insane for a deck that's as aggressive as Bonney. As such, I do personally play a playset of 4, cost around £20. However, you could cut some of these for the 5 cost S-Snake if you can't afford them or just don't like them. The new 9 cost Bonney from OP13 is mandatory at least 3 copies. A lot of people have her at 4, but I personally think 3 is enough because she is very findable. You don't need her in every game, though you will need her in a lot of games. And you really don't need more than 1. She's also going for around £1 a copy only, so if you did just want to pick up your playset, you absolutely could. It's only going to set you back £4. It's not hardly expensive, and she's definitely a good investment if you are planning on being a Bonney main. The final card that I think is important and has a bit of value is the Egghead Nami. Nami's removal effect is especially good into Green Zoro to remove 5 cost Shigi, to stop them either attacking with it or even reusing it with the 6 cost Law. But her effect comes up into pretty much everything except Emu. Into Ace, you can remove Marcos, you can remove Yamatos. Into other off-meta decks, and into Roger, you could remove a Bonclay. It's just a good card, and although it is £4 a copy, I'd recommend picking these up now, because when that Egghead Luffy starter deck comes out in January, this card may rise in price if either the Egghead Luffy leader, Vegapunk, or Bonney herself are majorly buffed by that deck. If the Nami is still a key part of these decks, then you could well see her price rise. The rest of the deck is mostly just cheap rares and a couple of cheap SRs, so the total for this deck is probably going to come out to around £40. Normally in these videos I like to cover around 10 decks, but with how much more closed off this meta is, and how friendly the top decks are to budget players, I decided to chop it down to 5 this time. If you have a favourite budget deck that I didn't mention, drop us a list in the comments and I'll check it out. Thank you for watching. Drink of the day was water, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.